400 years ago, the Dutch were carving a bloody path across Southeast Asia in their quest to dominate the global spice trade, a quest which culminated in the brutal conquest of the Indonesian island of Banda. Yet during this ruthless campaign, one of the most effective weapons wielded against their native enemies was not the musket or cannon, but an army of Japanese samurai mercenaries, exiled warriors for hire, who were highly sought after for their ferocity, fighting ability, and willingness to carry out orders no matter how cruel. But just how did this strange mix of castaway samurai, wandering adventurers, and traders turned pirates end up fighting for Europeans, thousands of miles from their homes on a remote island in Southeast Asia? The 15th and 16th centuries saw Japan ravaged by a series of almost unending wars that became known as the Sengoku or Warring States period. Rival warlords and clans battled against one another in a bloody contest for supremacy that left the country in ashes. However, by 1600, Japan was finally unified under the control of one man. Yet although the new Tokugawa shogunate was now firmly in control, the embers of war had yet to completely burn out, and conflict on a much smaller scale continued for years after, as the shogun consolidated his hold on power and tried to stamp out Christian and foreign influence in the country once and for all. Restrictions against Christians became more and more severe, while trade with foreigners was severely curtailed. However, it wasn't until 1635 that the Closed Country Edict was issued, a law which banned all Japanese from leaving the country and prevented any Japanese abroad from ever returning. Between the end of the civil wars and issuing of this edict, there existed an interesting but brief period of a few years where Japan had not yet isolated itself, a period where Japan traded with the rest of the world and even actively reached out to other nations. This more open-minded philosophy was characterized by the construction of the San Juan Bautista, a 500-ton ship that carried a Japanese diplomatic embassy to Europe and the Americas on a mission to seek out new trade agreements. Although this experiment was short-lived and ultimately failed, the brief window during which the country was open saw thousands of Japanese from all walks of life move overseas in search of new opportunities. Persecuted Christians, unemployed soldiers, and samurai who had fought for the losing side in the country's long-running wars went into a self-imposed exile across Asia. However, for large numbers of these men, war was the only trade they had ever known. Peace was bad for business, however there was no shortage of work in a region that was at the crossroads for one of the world's most lucrative and highly competitive trades. By 1600, precious spices like nutmeg had become amongst the world's most valuable commodities, prized for their reported medicinal properties and their capacity to add flavor to otherwise bland food. Traders were able to sell some spices in Europe for as much as 320 times what they paid for it in Asia. However, at that time, these precious trade goods could only be sourced from a handful of remote islands in Southeast Asia. With such massive potential profits for the taking, European traders and fortune seekers did everything in their power to monopolize the global spice trade, however subjugating the island's native population while fending off their fellow Europeans would require access to serious manpower. One of the most powerful and wealthy of these competing factions was the Dutch East India Company, one of the first joint stock companies in the world that had been granted a monopoly to carry out trade activities in Asia by the Dutch government. The company had powers similar to a fully fledged government, including the ability to negotiate treaties, strike its own coins, establish colonies, and even wage wars. Company executives fully intended to exploit these powers, and eagerly recruited mercenaries from all over Asia and Europe to defend and expand their interests. However, it would be in Japan that they saw an opportunity to access especially fierce and competent warriors who were willing to fight for a much lower price than European soldiers. In company records which still survive to this day, the Dutch describe the Japanese as bold men who exhibited great bravery in battle and were as good or even better than their European counterparts, fighters with a fearsome reputation that intimidated the enemy and who would follow any and all orders. More importantly, such fighting prowess could be obtained at a competitive price. Why hire Europeans when you can hire Japanese soldiers at a lower price without sacrificing quality? It was perhaps one of the earliest examples of corporate outsourcing in history. Satisfied with a small monthly salary and simple rations of rice and salted fish, the Japanese mercenaries were grateful for a contract and widely available. With Japan at peace, droves of unemployed soldiers were looking for work, amongst whom were large numbers of renowned samurai who had fallen on hard times after fighting on the losing side in the country's many civil wars. In the early 1600s, these outcasts found a new home in the ranks of European corporate armies operating in Southeast Asia. However, it would be the Dutch who became their most enthusiastic employers. The Dutch had visions of using armies of Japanese mercenary soldiers and samurai to dominate the region, securing the spice trade's lucrative profits solely for their investors. The Dutch East India Company's Governor-General was convinced that Japanese mercenaries could single-handedly help the company to achieve these lofty ambitions, and ordered his subordinates to begin recruiting as many as they could lay their hands on. He wanted the Dutch to go on the offensive and strike at the Asian centers of power of the Spanish and Portuguese rivals, using large numbers of Japanese mercenaries as the vanguard. In 1613, the company began recruiting hundreds of mercenaries from its trading base in western Japan, with 300 employed in the first contingent with the express permission of the shogun himself, who was perhaps glad to be rid of Christians and other samurai whose loyalties were questionable. While this might seem like a relatively small number, in those early days the company's entire military strength in Asia numbered just 500 men. The Japanese mercenaries made up a significant component of the company's military presence in Asia. Yet not everyone shared the Governor-General's enthusiasm for the samurai for hire. Other Europeans regarded them as rowdy and difficult to control, and the Dutch East India Company's chief merchant, the man in the field tasked with actually recruiting Japanese mercenaries, had grave doubts about the feasibility of the entire plan. He believed that the very warlike nature of Japanese samurai that had made them so famous and sought after by Europeans would be difficult for foreigners to harness and control. In letters to other company officials, he warned, quote, "They are dangerous to govern outside their land. If things do not go to their liking or when badly treated, they at once take a desperate attitude, which in their land would be prevented by rigorous justice or by tyranny. In this way they are lambs in Japan, but like devils outside their land." In other words, once the men had left their native Japan, they were no longer bound to the culture and rigorous social hierarchy that had made them so fearless and disciplined in the first place. Free from these constraints, they became unruly and even outright mutinous, and far more likely to place their own selfish interests first. To try and rein in the new recruits, the company forced all Japanese mercenaries to sign especially draconian contracts that governed every aspect of the 36-month term of service. They were forbidden to gamble, drink to intoxication, or partake in fights, and had to not only follow all orders issued by Dutch authorities, but also never question them or speak back in any way. A clause which highlights just how quickly the Japanese were gaining a reputation for insubordination when fighting outside of Japan. Furthermore, they had to pledge their willingness to be used in any way by their captain, and agree to be punished by death for any threat or attack against a superior officer. Yet these contracts did not only bind the fate of the individual soldier, but also the fate of their families back home. If a recruit violated his oath, the Dutch threatened to also punish his parents, wife, children, or anyone else standing as security for him. Such legal threats were intended to ensure the utter obedience of all Japanese mercenaries, tying them into what was essentially 36 months of inescapable bondage to the company. However, just how enforceable these draconian terms were is unknown. Despite the misgivings of several prominent company officials, the plan was put into motion, and between 1613 and 1623, Japanese samurai mercenaries took part in nearly all of the major Dutch East India Company campaigns in Southeast Asia, garrisoning company forts, as well as directly participating in attacks on Spanish strongholds in Indonesia. Yet their most infamous and controversial deployment would be at the brutal conquest of the Banda Islands in 1621. Encompassing a group of 11 remote islands on the edge of modern-day Indonesia, the Banda Islands were the sole source of the entire world's supply of nutmeg, one of the most valuable commodities on the planet, prized for its supposed ability to cure illness and disease. The Dutch first made contact with the islands in 1599, however 2 decades of attempts to force the native chiefs of the islands into restrictive trade contracts that gave Dutch traders a monopoly had failed with bloody results, culminating in the ambush and slaughter of a Dutch trading mission. The island's natives might have thought that this attack had rid them of Dutch influence once and for all. However, the Dutch East India Company never forgot the outrage. Retribution was on its way. Company officials decided that if the local people couldn't be persuaded to cooperate peacefully, then they would conquer the islands with naked force. In 1621, an invasion force containing a contingent of 87 Japanese mercenaries landed on the islands and quickly subdued their inhabitants. The Bandanese people were forced to make peace with the Dutch at gunpoint and agree to only supply Dutch merchants with the precious nutmeg. However, the peace would soon be broken with bloody consequences. According to one version of events, the sound of a hanging lamp falling over in the middle of the night convinced the Dutch that they were under attack. The Dutch captain responded by going on a murderous rampage, burning entire villages and slaughtering hundreds as he scoured the island for anyone he suspected of being a rebel, in a paranoid witch hunt that culminated in one of the most brutal acts of repression ever carried out by the company. Bandanese tribal leaders were rounded up, imprisoned in bamboo cages, and interrogated under torture that yielded confessions implicating the broken men in an island-wide conspiracy to overthrow the Dutch. 44 of the island's most prominent chiefs were found guilty of breaking the treaty they had signed and sentenced to death. However, unusually, the task of carrying out the sentence was given to 6 Japanese samurai mercenaries. On the day of the execution, the 6 samurai executioners for hire entered the main bamboo cage and dispatched the first 8 chiefs, with some accounts even reporting that they used their own sharp katanas to finish the job, chopping the bodies of the slain men into 4 pieces. The remaining 36 condemned chiefs were then beheaded by the samurai, their bodies mutilated and quartered, and their heads impaled and displayed on bamboo spears across the islands for all to see, a grisly reminder of the consequences of crossing the Dutch East India Company. By the end of the conquest, only 1,000 Bandanese people are thought to have remained on the islands, out of a pre-invasion population of over 15,000. 90% of the people had been slaughtered, died of disease or starvation, or deported and enslaved. However, Japanese mercenaries were not always the executioners. They sometimes found themselves the ones being executed. 2 years later, the intense spice trade rivalry between the Dutch and English East India Companies was ignited with deadly results when the Dutch governor of Ambon, an important clove-producing island in Indonesia, accused English merchants and Japanese mercenaries of conspiring to murder him and seize control of the Dutch fort on the island. The incident began when a Japanese samurai mercenary employed by the Dutch East India Company was caught asking questions about the defences of the Dutch fort on the island. When he failed to provide an adequate explanation for what he was doing, he was accused of being an English spy, arrested, and then tortured by waterboarding. It didn't take long for the man to break, and he confessed to being involved in a plot orchestrated by several English merchants who were working on the island. According to his confession, 10 Japanese mercenaries employed by the Dutch East India Company had been bribed by English merchants to seize the Dutch fort and assassinate the island's Dutch governor. Armed with this information, the Dutch governor arrested and tortured the other 9 Japanese mercenaries implicated in the plot, all of whom admitted to being English spies. The 10 Japanese mercenaries were found guilty by a hastily convened company court and sentenced to death, along with the 10 English merchants who were accused of being the conspiracy's ringleaders. While this penalty might have seemed severe, Dutch writers would later attempt to justify it by emphasizing just how dangerous the involvement of even just 10 Japanese mercenaries was, warning that even a small number of Japanese spies could easily sway the outcome of any conflict due to their valor and combat prowess. In their eyes, just 10 Japanese mercenaries was the equivalent of many times that number from another nation. Yet it wasn't just the Dutch that tried to harness the famed martial abilities of Japanese samurai mercenaries during this period. In the early 17th century, Japanese exile warriors for hire were employed by rulers across Southeast Asia as elite shock troops, royal bodyguards, and obedient executioners, with some historians estimating that as many as 100,000 Japanese were living overseas as mercenaries, traders, or slaves. In 1603, the Spanish employed over 500 Japanese mercenaries to put down revolts of ethnic Chinese residents in the city of Manila in the Philippines, where they served as the spearhead in a bloody campaign of suppression that saw 20,000 residents slaughtered in the city's Chinese quarter. The Spanish also planned to use Japanese mercenaries to invade China itself. However, ultimately the plan was never put into motion, and both the Portuguese and Dutch made use of Japanese mercenaries in several minor skirmishes with pirates and native tribes across their trade empires. There are even reports of Japanese mercenaries being hired as far afield as Mexico. Yet perhaps one of the most well-known and largest contingents of Japanese mercenaries abroad was found in what is now modern-day Thailand. A Japanese trader named Yamada Nagamasa found his way to the Thai kingdom of Ayutthaya in 1612, where he rose to become the head of the Japanese village, a zone of the capital city made up of thousands of Japanese traders, Christians who had fled from persecution at home, and samurai who had fought on the losing side during Japan's civil wars. These outcasts had fled Japan to escape the new shogun's wrath. However, their military training and experience was welcomed with open arms by the Thai king, who created a special unit made up solely of Japanese volunteers. Nagamasa became the leader of this army of volunteer samurai, and the unit distinguished itself in several engagements across Thailand, and they are even said to have been allowed to fly the Japanese flag in battle. At the height of his influence, Nagamasa acted as an important diplomatic intermediary between the Thai king and Japanese shogun. However, his involvement in royal affairs would ultimately bring about his downfall, and he was poisoned in 1630 when a new king usurped the Thai throne and eliminated all advisors deemed to be loyal to the previous monarch. Despite the high demand for Japanese mercenaries, the supply of new recruits would not last. Following a rebellion that involved large numbers of Japanese Christians, the shogun decided to curtail foreign influence in Japan once and for all, and issued what became known as the Closed Country Edict in 1635, a law which effectively banned all Japanese from entering or leaving the country on pain of death. The thousands of Japanese traders, workers, and mercenaries living in other countries were stranded abroad almost overnight. This lost army of exiles forever cut off from home as Japan entered a period of isolation that would last for over 200 years. I hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and I hope to see you again soon.